Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Adam Smith Institute webinar. Thanks for registering and spending an hour of your Tuesday evening with us. My name is Daniel Pryor, and I'm the head of programs at the ASI. And for those of you joining us who aren't familiar with the ASI, we're a free market think tank based in London in the UK. And our goal is to try to change government policy and public opinion through our research, our media, events such as these, and education programs. So this evening's webinar is focused on trying to explore the role that tobacco harm reduction, products like e-cigarettes, heated tobacco, snus, and nicotine pouches can play in improving the health of Brits by helping smokers to make the switch to safer or lower risk alternatives. And I'm just going to quickly set the scene, and then we'll go to our first speaker in a few minutes. So 2021, this year, is clearly a pivotal year, perhaps the most important yet in the UK's fight against smoking. With less than a decade left before we need to achieve the government's goal of a smoke-free society, a prevalence rate of less than 5% by 2030, we're now arguably better placed than we have been ever before to improve on our already world-leading harm reduction approach, both at home in terms of domestic regulation and abroad as well. And it's vital that we do so if we really want to maximize the positive impact that safer alternatives to smoking can have on the nation's health and well-being. Now, some of you may be aware that our public health bodies in the UK, as well as many prominent health NGOs, are in broad consensus that over the past decade, e-cigarettes have played a very significant role in accelerating the decline in smoking rates and reducing health harms for nicotine users across the country. We've also had other emerging alternatives like heated tobacco and nicotine pouches that could also play a larger role in light of a recent plateau in smokers who have tried vaping. But there's also plenty of room for improvement in our e-cigarette regulation, as we'll get onto later. Now, having left the European Union, lawmakers are arguably better able to pass sort of vital regulatory reforms that will help more smokers make the switch. We've also got the forthcoming tobacco control plan later this year, which presents a perfect opportunity to build on our past successes in smoking cessation. And the UK's representatives at the 9th Conference of Parties for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which takes place later this year, have a really golden chance to showcase the superiority of the UK's approach to smoking cessation. So in summary, this year, we have a golden opportunity through tobacco harm reduction to demonstrate how taking a different regulatory path from the EU and exerting our independent influence on the world stage can save the lives of millions of smokers, both at home and abroad. Now, as someone who personally has lost loved ones to smoking-related disease and also quit smoking myself with the help of reduced risk products, I'm pretty passionate about this area, and I know that tonight's wonderful speakers we've got lined up are as well. So without further ado, first up, we are pleased to be joined this evening by Mark Oates, who is, amongst other things, the director of We Vape, a consumer campaign organization that is set up to help vapers get their voices heard by politicians. He's also currently a fellow at the Adam Smith Institute, and he also founded, clearly a busy man, the Snus and Nicotine Pouch Users Alliance, which campaigns to legalize the sale of Swedish snus in the UK. And just to start us off, Mark, if you could perhaps run us through the current state of play with tobacco harm reduction in the UK, some of our past successes and current challenges, that would be great. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Daniel. I think it's important to say that Britain is in a pretty good position. When you look around the world and you see countries such as India banning e-cigarettes and Australia, where you can't get e-cigarettes easily, you have to go via your doctor. So it's actually harder to get e-cigarettes than it is cigarettes, which you can just get down the shop. We have to say that we are in a pretty good position, but I don't think that's enough. I think we actually need to go further if we're going to achieve smoke-free 2030. We've got around 3.5 million vapers in the UK. About 60% of those have stopped smoking entirely, and around 40% are dual users. We've still got around 7 million smokers in the UK. And as you say, that's flatlined. The number of vapers was coming down dramatically. Sorry, the number of vapers has been increasing dramatically, and at the same time, smokers has been coming down. But we've got to sort of plateau. In terms of regulation, our regulations come from our membership of the EU, which has passed over onto UK law. And I think now that we've left the EU, I think we can clearly see that perhaps we had a lot of influence in maintaining a perhaps more pro-vaping stance than it had we not been in the EU, because the EU's just released its Beating Cancer plan, which frankly has a lot of policies in it which will encourage cancer, such as taxing vaping. It wants to tax vaping, which I think even the most humble student of economics would see that that would be detrimental to its use and encourage smoking. It also wants to ban vaping in public places and outdoors, which, if you know that vaping is very safe for the user, then you'll know that passive vaping is hardly any risk, and particularly outdoors. As well, they wish to ban flavors, which is a major attraction to encourage people away from smoking. So it's not a good policy at all. So we are in a good position, but we're not, I think, going to achieve smoke-free 2030, which is a 5% reduction, sorry, a 5% of the UK population smoking by 2030. We actually have to not just sit with the status quo, we have to bring out some policies which could achieve that change. I think to understand how we can achieve that change, what policies we need to achieve that change, we need to look at why vaping in the UK is so successful. And I think the most important thing about it was vaping became successful not because of government diktat. It wasn't bureaucrats coming on high and telling people how to live their lives. It was actually individual consumers finding a product they actually enjoyed and starting to use it. So I know Adam Smith Institute followers will enjoy that side of things, pro-consumer element. Also, what we need for vaping, what made vaping successful was that it was different to smoking. It had a number of things that made it more attractive, such as the price. So smoking in the UK is vastly more expensive than anywhere else in the world. And in many ways that comes with its own problems because it creates huge inequalities of wealth, as some of our poorest people have to spend huge amounts of money on cigarettes. But that price differential actually helped encourage people away from smoking because they could make huge savings. Also, marketing. When vaping came along, it came out of nowhere and there was no real regulation because it wasn't actually a tobacco product. So there was an ability for people to inform the public through advertising about it. And that's been very helpful to get people to take up the product. And ultimately, the product itself is very enjoyable. You know, people like the flavors, and we shouldn't be worried about that in some ways. You know, people enjoy doing things that they find pleasurable, and that's a natural human reaction. And so where harm reduction comes in is we recognize that people are going to do things they enjoy. And rather than just telling people not to do things, if we can say, well, there's an option here you can take, you don't have to take, but it's going to be vastly safer than smoking, then there you go. And so in terms of the future, we need to look at other products. I think, as I said, smoking is plateaued, vaping increases has plateaued. So the new options, as you mentioned, things like Swedish snus, which I've been campaigning to legalize in the UK. I think we've got to take the opportunity now we've left the EU to legalize it. And that will give another option for consumers to choose. And nicotine pouches as well. I had someone who worked with me on something completely unrelated, and I happened to tell him, as I probably tell lots of people, about snus. And he'd actually tried to quit smoking through vaping, and it hadn't worked for him. But he tried some nicotine pouches, and he said, "This is it. You know, I've been smoking 15 years, tried vaping, didn't work for me. But I've suddenly been told about nicotine pouches, and I've made the switch." So we need a smorgasbord, and within that smorgasbord of options for smokers, there's also heat not burn, and that's where something like marketing comes in and informing the public. The public don't know about snus. The public don't know about nicotine pouches. The public don't know about heat not burn. And that's a problem, because how is someone going to be able to make the change to a safer product if they're not aware this safer product exists? And so I think we need to see regulation that allows companies to use their own money, not public money, to inform the public of the independent research which is out there. You know, it doesn't have to be company research. We've got Public Health England data saying that vaping is 95% safer than smoking. Why can't we allow them to inform the public on that? And to give you a flavor of that problem, of the public perception around vaping, 60% of the public in the latest polling I saw, 60% of smokers thought that vaping was as dangerous as smoking. And that obviously is going to be detrimental and encourage them to switch over. And a study was done which found that every 1% increase in the number of smokers who thought that vaping was as dangerous as smoking, there was a 0.6% decline in the number of vapers. Now that calculates as around 36%. We could see a 36% reduction in smokers if they had access to the truth regarding the relative risk around vaping. This public perception and smoker perception around vaping is largely born about from a huge number of scare stories in the press. You'll see headlines such as popcorn lung, and when you delve into the detail, it's quite clear that it's not as it's presented in the headline. And I would call this a thing, I like to call it new technology bias. When you've got a new technology, any kind of snippet of information about that causing a problem hits the headlines. So driverless cars, I think, is a really perfect example. People have seen that whenever a driverless car is in an accident, it's all over the news worldwide. You know, a driverless Tesla has crashed in California. It's on British news. But the fact that thousands of car crashes and thousands of car crash deaths happen every day that don't hit the headlines, it means public perceptions get skewed. And we're seeing that a lot with vaping. So we really need to make sure, in order to achieve smoke-free 2030, we can get more information out to vapers to change the public perception around smoking risk, and also inform the public about the other options available in regards to these products. And you mentioned COP9, which is coming up. And this is going to be quite an important battleground for the UK, because we're finally going to be sitting at the COP9 table as an independent country. And I think we need to use that opportunity to try and encourage the world to follow our lead and help reduce deaths worldwide. It's still, smoking is killing 7-8 million people a year. And there's a battle going on over the next century to save 1 billion lives. So that's why I think vaping and harm reduction products is so important.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mark. Just a couple of follow-up questions before we move on to our next speaker. And also just a reminder that all of you watching along can submit your questions for our speakers via the Zoom Q&A function, which we'll get to in the second half of the webinar. So Mark, according to the latest Action on Smoking and Health data, which you referenced in your remarks, almost half of British smokers have tried vaping, but they've gone back to cigarettes, with the most common reason being that it just didn't feel like smoking a cigarette enough. Better knowledge about relative risk, which you mentioned, is undoubtedly good, but do you think that vaping has already reached the kind of the low-hanging fruit for smoking cessation? Or is this kind of more to do with past experiences with perhaps earlier, less advanced e-cigarettes?
I think past experiences have an effect, and the products have improved over time. And I have spoken to people who have tried products right at the beginning, and then they've not enjoyed them. But because it's a consumer product and you've got these companies involved, they're evolving that product to make it better. So that has certainly helped. And that's a really good argument why over-regulation, and if these products were a pharmaceutical product, the products that would have come out, they would have to go through huge amounts of regulation. It would take years and millions of pounds. Those products would have been pickled in aspic, and they wouldn't be able to develop them. And that wouldn't have had the effect of making 3 million people quit smoking and turn to vaping. We have to recognize that all nicotine delivery systems, the way you deliver nicotine is different. So whether it's through snus and the mucous membrane, or the type of where you're vaping or heat not burn or smoking, there's always a slight difference. And so if there's people out there that have tried vaping and it hasn't worked for them, then hopefully other products such as snus, like the individual I mentioned, could have the option. And I think Martin may speak more about this, because the NNA has done some great work on some policy proposals. But our regulations that we've taken over from the EU are inhibiting people who maybe don't like vaping because we've got a 20 milligram nicotine limit. Now that means if you're a heavy smoker, then you're not maybe getting the hit you need from vaping, so you're not going to make that switch. So there is an argument to increase that limit, and then that would incentivize people or encourage people, or they prefer vaping and they might switch.
And just finally, you mentioned the cost differential between vaping and cigarettes playing a role in helping people to switch. Do you see vaping having a kind of broader impact on health inequalities? Because from my knowledge, there's some evidence, at least in the UK and a little bit in the US as well, that smokers from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and also LGBT smokers are more inclined to give vaping a go than the kind of average of the general population.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that when it comes to health inequality, poorer groups are more likely to smoke, and they're also likely to have worse health outcomes. And obviously they're poorer groups. So if people are switching from smoking to vaping, they're going to see more money in their pocket. I mean, you can save. Some people are spending £2,000-3,000 a year on smoking, and the poorest people in the UK have got very poor incomes, maybe £9,000. So sometimes a third of their income being spent on cigarettes, and you can suddenly be saving £2,000-3,000 a year by vaping. So that's hugely important. And then also the knock-on effect that their health's improved, and we're improving the health of the poorest people. I think generally, and this comes back to individual choice and freedom, is when you speak to people, sometimes, conversations I've had with people who work with homeless people, and how proud they are that they made the switch themselves to something like vaping, and they've improved their lives. And it hasn't been something they've been told to do necessarily. It's something they've wanted to do.
So there's kind of an individual agency aspect to it. Right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Mark. Moving on to our next speaker, who is Martin Culler, the chair of the New Nicotine Alliance, which is an organization that seeks to support and promote tobacco harm reduction in the UK. Martin, I know that the NNA recently wrote to the Minister of Public Health setting out plans for this post-Brexit reform of regulation that Mark mentioned as well. So what are the sort of things that we should be aiming to change about our domestic approach to reduced risk products?
Okay, I suppose for your viewers, I should first start by introducing who the NNA is. New Nicotine Alliance is a consumer association. We're a registered charity. Our aim is to promote the further availability of reduced risk products. Many of us, like me, I'm a vapor. I used to be a smoker. We use them ourselves, and we understand the benefits. We don't take any money off of industry of any sort. We're just funded by private donations. So we have a small budget, but we're a committed bunch of people, and we think we're doing some good work. Also, I think it might be worth starting by explaining the benefit, the definition of harm reduction, because we're talking about harm reduction as if it's something that everyone knows about. With regards to tobacco, it might surprise many people that the WHO, Framework Convention of Tobacco Control, actually has a definition of it, because one of its articles is dedicated to harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction, which is strange considering they are making a lot of effort to try and attack vaping in particular and other reduced risk products. Their definition is tobacco control is a range of supply, demand and harm reduction strategies that aim to improve the health of the population by eliminating or reducing their consumption of tobacco products and exposure to tobacco smoke. Now, in this regard, the UK could really be considered a world leader, especially on vaping. And we'd like the country to also be the world leader on tobacco harm reduction in general. The tobacco control plan, for example, which is being updated in July, as I think Mark mentioned, talks about helping people to quit smoking by permitting innovative technologies that minimize the risk of harm and to maximize the availability of safe alternatives to smoking. But we do have an opportunity coming up with Brexit to diverge from EU regulations in this area, which they are sort of turning people away. They're over precautionary, but there's also a threat that we might carry on with EU regulations, and this is a particular threat because this year the Tobacco Products Directive is being updated. Now, TPD2, as it was back in, it was all debated about 2012, 2013, and the regulations came in 2016. And some of the regulations you might have heard about was limits on nicotine strengths, which are not high enough. You know, when I first used an e-cigarette to quit smoking, it was 27 milligrams. The limit now is 20. I simply wouldn't have had enough nicotine to wean me off of cigarettes at the time. I'm now down to about 18, but that's where I'm happy. and also on things like bottle size, it's pointless. You can only have a 10 milliliter bottle size. It's just kind of a moral panic about these things when regulators really regulating something they didn't know about. So we do have this update of the Tobacco Products Directive, the TPD, but we also have Brexit, and we actually wrote to the Department of Health and Social Care to say that this is an opportunity that we should take. I mean, in November last year, a minister said in the House of Commons that just because we have Brexit, we are not necessarily going to diverge from the TPD. And we haven't heard yet if we are diverging from the TPD. So when we wrote to the Department of Health, we were saying we really should take this opportunity because we don't want to get tied in with some of the worst excesses that could come out in the TPD3. So, for example, there's a risk to UK consumers of having flavours banned, as Mark mentioned. We could have black lists of ingredients or even white lists of what's allowed and what's not. There's already talk of an attempt to ban open systems. Danger. I mean, I've got an open system here. I wouldn't do without it. And vaping to be treated the same as smoking, like Mark said. The Beating Cancer Plan has talked about banning vaping outside as well. So some of these things, really, we need to diverge from the EU regulations. We need to take the opportunity because the threat of us not doing so is pretty stark. We as the NNA feel that these things are a win-win, really, for public health. I mean, they don't involve coercion. There's no cost to the taxpayer. People are going to vape shops, for example, and buying their own kit. They're buying their own nicotine pouches, which are now available in newsagents. This isn't throwing money at state-sponsored organisations. They're not throwing millions of pounds at people to sit down in clinics with you. These are people just doing it off their own back. And it's increased choice. We want to increase the choice of nicotine products available. You know, we're not trying to force people to quit smoking. We want to encourage people to quit smoking. You know, the carrot instead of the stick. If someone chooses to quit smoking using an e-cigarette, then that's a good thing for us. So we came up with a number of recommendations, and I'll go through them. This is what we'd like to see from the government, and we can do this after Brexit, and we think it would be a good thing for the UK. And like I said, as we're a world leader in this, it'd be a good example to show the rest of the world to see how policy can be done. Firstly, there's a ban in the EU of snus. Now, this is a product that has been used for hundreds of years in Nordic countries. Sweden, as a result of having snus, has by far the lowest smoking rates in the EU and by far the lowest tobacco-related cancer rates in the EU. And yet, for some strange reason, snus is banned everywhere in the EU except in Sweden. Now, that should be lifted. It's a silly ban. It came about in the 80s and the 90s when there was this big moral panic about snus, which is just little tea bag type bags of pasteurized tobacco that just sits underneath your lip and directs nicotine into your membrane and your gum. And this is harmless. I mean, people talk about vaping is at least 95% safer than smoking. Well, snus is even safer than that, and yet it's banned all over Europe. That really, we can lift that ban. There's no reason not to. The second one, obviously, the nicotine concentrations. Like I said, I needed something more than 20. There were a lot of people who could do with more than 20 milligrams and might be attracted away from smoking if there were stronger options available. That seems to be a no-brainer because there were millions of people who vaped more than that when it was allowed. But in 2016, that was closed off because of the EU. Same with the e-liquid bottles, 10 milligrams. Why? You can buy 1.5 litres of bleach, but for some reason you can't sell nicotine e-liquid in more than 10 millilitres. Sorry. Advertising as well. There's no point in having these safer products if smokers don't know they're there. It just seems absolutely bizarre that in this country we can advertise on things like billboards and on the side of buses, but you can't because of the EU, advertise anywhere which crosses a border. So if someone in Germany or France can see the advert, it's not allowed. Now, personally, I would like to see vaping advertised in the break between the two parts of Coronation Street. I mean, that's the best way of telling smokers there are options out there for them. But that's not allowed at the moment. It has to be very low scale, and it's just, again, it's more precautionary than it should be. Warnings, we have bizarre warnings on vaping products at the moment, especially. So, for example, we have here, this is something I use, and this is just a battery. There's nothing else. This thing twists off. That's where your liquid is and everything else. But this battery, when I bought it, had it came on its own in a box. It had a warning on it saying this product contains nicotine and is very addictive. It's a battery. You know, why do we want warnings like that on products which people can use? They can go to a vape shop and buy them, or they can get them online to help them quit smoking. Why do we need to warn them away? What we should have instead is communications of risk, which are more in keeping with the nature of these products. Information, it's illegal to say that vaping is safer than smoking. You cannot make that claim anywhere at the moment. I mean, it's quite clearly true, and yet this is not allowed. So we need to allow a proper communication of relative risk to consumers and say that this is the relative risk of these products compared with smoking, to make people make an informed choice. So we'd like that to be allowed. Inserts, tobacco legislation says that tobacco companies are not allowed to put any information in their cigarette packets whatsoever. Now, we'd like that changed to say that they can put, for example, an insert saying, why are you smoking this? Why didn't you try our vaping alternative instead? We don't see a downside to that. Like I said, it's if you want to encourage safer products, as is detailed in the Tobacco Control Plan, why would you not allow smokers to be advertised to directly that they've bought that packet? And this isn't advertising to kids. This is advertising to people who are currently buying cigarettes. And it seems a no-brainer again. Tank and bottle sizes I've mentioned. And the last one is to recognise and regulate novel oral nicotine products, which is nicotine pouches, which Mark had mentioned. So that there's standards in place, and at the moment there isn't any, which means there are some bad actors around. We want some regulation. Obviously, it's got to be very light touch regulation, but it's got to be something that's enforceable to stop all the worst products getting out there. So that's what we'd like to see. We think this is all workable. All these suggestions are workable. It's just whether the government has the will to do it. And the other option, obviously, is to just carry on following EU regulations, which is the worst of all options and could be even worse once TPD3 comes in. So we'd like to see a change, and we don't see anything really controversial in any of that.
Oh, thanks very much for that, Martin. I see your cat strongly agrees with all the statements that you've made. Just one quick follow-up question from me before we move on to our final speaker. On the specifics of some of this regulatory reform post-Brexit, what do you think is the best way to kind of demarcate lower risk products when we've had mentioned there's vaping, there's heated tobacco, there's snus, there's nicotine pouches, which are all quite different products in a sense. Do you think there should be separate kind of regulatory categories for each of them, or just a more broad divide between, say, combustion and non-combustion, low risk versus high risk, something along those lines?
Well, that's what I was going to say when you started the question. Is why are we still regulating based on whether where it contains tobacco or whether it doesn't? Snus contains tobacco, but it's one of the lowest risk products out there. It should be combustion or non-combustion. You know, when you look at a graph of the level of risk between, say, combustion products and non-combustion products, you look at the graph and you've got cigarettes up there, and then there's a cliff edge. It just drops. So when we're saying these things are safer than cigarettes, people say, oh yeah, but cigarettes are really dangerous. Yes, they are, but these things are really much less dangerous. So the demarcation, like you said, should be between combustible and non-combustible. Unfortunately, you know, it's a decades-long thing where people in public health have tended to sort of just see tobacco as this big, you know, ugly, evil behemoth. But the attitudes need to change, and they need to see that it's not the tobacco that's the danger, it's the combustion or the non-combustion of it.
Well, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Martin, and move on to our final speaker before we go to questions from our lovely viewers. And that is Clive Bates, who is the director of Counterfactual, which is a consulting and advocacy practice focused on a pragmatic approach to sustainability and public health. It's worth noting that from 1997 to 2003, he was also the Director of Action on Smoking and Health in the UK, campaigning to reduce the harms caused by tobacco. Clive, I was hoping that you could try to cover and explore some of the international prospects for tobacco harm reduction this year, such as the previously mentioned Conference of Parties, and how the UK can help to exert a positive influence at these sort of events.
All right, John, I'm going to be quite quick because I think it'd be good if we could get on to questions as well. I hope people will put questions into the chat and the Q&A system so we can drive the rest of the session with that. The basic headline on the international front is pretty bleak, basically. We have seen over a series of Conference of the Parties, 2014, 2016, 2018, of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, a gradual hardening and hostility towards tobacco harm reduction, e-cigarettes, and increasingly now to heated tobacco products. With essentially WHO and the Secretariat and the parties developing a narrative that sort of encourages prohibition. So their idea that the big policy, the right idea, is prohibition, but if you can't do that, then here are some other things that you can do, and those would be to regulate as stringently as you would regulate cigarettes, even though the risks are 2 orders of magnitude different. Regulate like pharmaceuticals, regulate like poisons. At no point, and increasingly in the recent communications, has WHO and this convention kind of embraced the idea that there might just be an enormous opportunity here to reduce cancer, heart disease, and lung conditions like COPD. That just doesn't enter their narrative now. It did in the early stages, but it's been squeezed out. The WHO's become, I would say, quite stridently anti-science. It's extremely partial in its reading of the literature. It's essentially a propagandist in many respects. Notably with the Q&A it did on e-cigarettes, which was released in January last year, about a year ago, absolutely laughably awful and had to be withdrawn and rewritten to be only merely just terrible. It's tended to take strike policy positions, which it never really owns. It says these are things that you can do, or these are things that parties are doing, without ever being mindful of the prospects for unintended consequences. So, for example, a prohibition will cause black markets, it will cause vapers to relapse to smoking, it will cause smokers not to take up vaping, it will cause counterfeits, it will cause unregulated products, workaround behaviors like home mixing and so on. None of that ever enters their narrative or discourse about the policy proposals that they actually make. However, they are getting increasingly confident and bold at making these things. This year is a year of particularly high risk, as we have the EU also moving forward on the Tobacco Products Directive. The WHO tends to look to the EU for, kind of looks over its shoulders and asks, EU, is this okay if we do this? We're seeing major players in the EU pursuing things like flavor bans. So the Netherlands proposal, the Finns, the Spanish, and one other I can't remember, are pursuing flavor bans at the moment. So that might start to emerge as something the EU wants to normalize. If that happens, it will be kind of embraced in the FCTC. It won't be made mandatory. It will just be encouraged. That's what the FCTC does. It doesn't really set down rules, which are then enforced and sanctions applied if you don't do them. What it does is encourage the parties to see that that's what they should be doing. It does that across all the domains of its activities. There are other things that are in the pipeline. Their scientific advisory committee recommended banning open systems, recommended nicotine limits, recommended banning all claims, recommended that heated tobacco products should either be banned or regulated with the same severity as cigarettes. So generally, a move and movement in these conventions that is extremely hostile to the concept of tobacco harm reduction, seeing only risks, which I would say are negligible to non-existent, and being completely blind or willfully avoiding the huge potential opportunities there are in moving maybe hundreds of millions of people from dangerous combustible products to not very dangerous non-combustible products. How to deal with that? It requires member states to stand up and be counted. I'm hoping that the UK will do that now that it is freed basically of the EU. The EU negotiates as a bloc in the FCTC. So if the UK is freed of the EU, it could have its own independent voice. Sadly, many of the people involved are quite spineless, and the nature of these meetings is that they tend to try to form consensus rather than one party holding out with its red line and stopping the WHO doing things that are terrible. Because the language is always quite soft, the bureaucrats say, well, do we have to do this? If we don't have to do it, then it doesn't breach our red line and we can let it go. But unfortunately, that encourages everybody else to do terrible things. So I'll leave it there. I'd like to handle any further points on this really through Q&A, if that's okay, Daniel.
Yep, no problem at all. We'll bring in the rest of the panel. Thank you for that, Clive, and we'll move on to the general Q&A. And already I've seen a couple of questions looking at the potential risk of non-smokers beginning to vape, and also the risk of young people starting to vape who otherwise wouldn't have taken up cigarettes. Does anyone have any thoughts on that or anything they'd like to share?
Well, I'd say,
go on, Martin, please.
Well, I'd say, just one thing. We've talked about reduction in risk, and the Royal College's position says vaping in particular is less than 5% as harmful as smoking. So you get 20 youth vaping, you need 20 youth to start vaping to counteract the one youth who doesn't smoke. So when you've got 20 times more vapers and you've got current youth smokers, then maybe we can talk about the harms of vaping. But Clive is probably better to answer this one than me.
Well, no, actually, that's a very good answer, Martin. The question about a gateway effect is, even if there was one and people were taking up, or people were taking up vaping who, there's two different kind of concerns at work when people talk about the gateway effect. The first thing is they say, well, people who would have never used nicotine take up vaping, okay? And they become a nicotine user when they know they would have been. Now, it's not a great thing, but it's not the end of the world either. People use drugs of all kinds, alcohol, caffeine, in widespread use, and providing it's not doing you an enormous amount of harm, shouldn't worry too much about it. It's not a particularly big problem in the landscape of youth risk behaviors compared to all the other things that are going on in young people's lives. The other thing that people say is, well, is there a gateway effect that means that once people get started on nicotine via vaping, they then become smokers and they become lifelong smokers, and then they die and get cancer and all the rest of it. And actually it has a lethal effect on them. Now, there's very little evidence that that actually happens of any type. And in fact, all the evidence really points the other way. What we do see is an association between vaping and smoking, but that is because the same things that incline young people to smoke also incline them to vape. So it's to do with the individual, their genes, their mental health condition, their family circumstances, their household, their schools, their community, their educational performance, their substance use, blah, blah, blah. All of these things sort of travel together. The vaping and the smoking kind of travel together in people who have that kind of life. And that has confused maybe deliberately in some cases, some people into thinking that the association that you see between vaping and smoking is causal, that the vaping causes the smoking. No evidence for that at all. And actually, as we've seen youth vaping rise, we've seen youth smoking fall at an accelerated rate, which is certainly not consistent with a gateway effect. So as I say, two separate things with youth vaping to keep your eye on. For the most part, it's beneficial, I think. It's a controversial view, but the people who are more likely to be frequent vapers and therefore have a more, if you like, compulsive approach to vaping are far more likely to be smokers or otherwise would be smokers. And for them, the vaping may well be beneficial. So although there's a lot of moral panic about youth vaping, the harm reduction argument works just as well with adolescents as it does with adults, as you would expect.
Yeah, I've always found the helpful comparison here is you wouldn't say that vaping causes people to drive too fast on the motorway, even though there's probably quite a strong association between the two. It's just that the same group of people have a certain propensity towards risk-taking behaviors, for example. A question from the ASI fellow, Jonathan Kitson. Why does the panel think the UK struggles with risk communication, and what could be done to improve this? Just a quick thought from me on this before we go to the panel. One of the proposals that I saw a few years ago that I found quite good on this was from Health Canada, where they proposed a kind of generic list of risk statements that could be put onto e-cigarette and reduced risk product packaging to kind of, that was approved by Health Canada. And that way you'd kind of have some sort of regulation over what sort of statements could be made, but it would still have that positive risk communication effect. Perhaps Mark, if you wanted to kind of share maybe what the problems are and how we can improve.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I don't think we are the worst. If you look at America, they're having a lot tougher time of it, and some of the organizations and headlines over there are pretty scary and putting people off vaping and keeping them smoking. But it's classic media headlines. Bit of an odd story on this one, but my mum contacted me and told me there was a headline that said that if you catch COVID, you're less likely to be fertile as a man. Now, I think that says a lot about what my mum's interests are, but when I read the report, I looked into it and it said at the bottom quite clearly that all coronaviruses can reduce male sperm count. And in this very study, they found out after a few months, it went back to normal. So, but the headline was COVID reduces male fertility. So it's a very similar thing when you look at vaping, and people have to encourage people to really look into the detail, and encourage newspaper editors to recognize that they have a moral duty, not just to try and attract attention, but tell the truth to the public, because it is going to lead to more deaths.
So we've got a few more questions that kind of focus on some of the alternatives other than e-cigarettes. Eric mentions that a lot of the major tobacco companies are starting to focus on heated tobacco more, and ask what the panelists' thoughts are if heat not burn ends up becoming the kind of the dominant form of tobacco harm reduction. Would that make the case a lot harder to make, since they are tobacco products and they look, according to Eric, like miniature cigarettes?
If I may, on that one, well, first of all, I would see this. I would see the strategy of harm reduction requiring, benefiting from having as many options and as many pathways as you can. Different products that meet different people's needs in different circumstances. The heated tobacco products are good. I have a massive N=1 survey of a friend of mine who'd tried e-cigarettes, wanted to quit smoking, been smoking for 30 odd years. I bumped into him at Waterloo Station and he says, "I've cracked it. I've got one of these heated things and it really does the job." So for him, that worked when e-cigarettes didn't work. For others, they're trying to get away from the smoking experience to the greatest extent and at the greatest rate possible, which is why they would rather, vape peach Melba than have some kind of, tobacco flavor. So each to their own, I say, and the greater the diversity, the more viable pathways there will be away from smoking. There was a really interesting study published about a week ago that suggested, there was a review of all the biomarker studies that have been done on vaping and heated tobacco products. suggesting that there wasn't really that much difference in risk between heated tobacco products and vaping products when it comes to the biomarkers you can actually measure in the body. So they're much more similar to each other and both radically different from cigarette exposures. That's the way I think of it. So I'm keen to encourage these products to be as diverse as possible, that we have a mix of the 4 broad categories: vaping, heated tobacco products, smokeless tobacco, and then these new nicotine oral pouches. That's the sort of 4 platforms going forward that I think will ultimately lead to the obsolescence of the cigarette. Does it make it harder to win arguments? Yes, because the sort of hated tobacco companies are involved, and that tends to bring their reputational baggage into the story, which really does annoy me, I have to say, because it means that people are more concerned about the aesthetics of this and who's doing what and who's behind it than they are about the actuality of, you know, dying of cancer and living in misery with COPD. And I think the public health people just have to get over themselves on this and recognize that these products are going to be made by tobacco companies, and that it's a good thing that they're in the market for these products, gradually, hopefully quickly, moving away from the sort of merchant of death business that they've been in for the last 60 years or so.
Martin, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, just a little, you know, like Clive, I've got a friend in Birmingham who tried a heated tobacco product, which I brought up there when I was staying up there one time. She'd never heard of them. And this is the big problem I have in this country with it, not the fact they exist, but the fact that most people don't know about them, because, you know, vaping is good for some people, heated tobacco is good for other people. But this is what we talk about furthering the availability of all these products. You've got to imagine that the only way you could get nicotine for hundreds of years was dried leaves rolled up in a tube and set fire to. And now you have all these different options. And whereas before, you know, lots of people were smokers, but they might be different individuals. This is the entire point of the continuum of risk and the different options available. This is the choice. This is the way that you can give people whatever they want. You know, some people, like Clive said, want like the taste of smoking. Other people want to get away from it. Some people like snus. They don't like the inhaling. Other people would like something dissolvable, and some people want patches and gum. But it has to be that there is an availability of different products for people to choose, and that's the best way of getting people to volunteer themselves to quit smoking, rather than having to spend a whole load of our taxes on organisations that try and club people into quitting.
Question coming from Michael that I think is very much suited to Mark and Martin here. What role can consumers play in kind of opposing some of the new harsh regulation recommendations? What advice would you give to them?
Well, I think it's really important to mobilise and invigorate consumers. I think we find that difficult in the UK because we're actually being quite successful at it. But over in America, they're very noisy, and politicians need to take notice of the power they have, the millions of vapors that could swing elections. I'm very interested in the fact that there was in the UK a lot of anti-EU sentiment that came about because of some of the TPD regulations. And did that have an effect on Brexit? Well, it might not have been the main reason, but I can certainly see it changing, particularly in the north of the UK, where there's a big vaping community, changing people's opinions. So Michael, you know, I know you're running the World Vapors Alliance, doing some great work there. We've got to try and persuade people, haven't we, that there is a risk and that they have the power to change that. And I think politicians do listen if they realise their seat's on the line. If, you know, you're a constituency MP in the UK and you've got 5,000 vapors and they all say, look, I'm not going to vote for you if you go down this path of anti-vaping, then a lot of the majorities, that's quite a lot of voters. So remind vapors that they have power and encourage them to get involved in the democratic process.
Yeah, I'd echo
a quick one. You go ahead.
I'd echo that. This is right on my street, because this is something I can just tell you that gave a prediction at the start of the year on a prominent blog for harm reductionists, saying that apathy is our biggest threat, because far too many people seem to think that now we've left the EU, that's it, the game's over, we can't be touched. And that's not the case at all. There are plenty of threats still around, and vapers especially, and anyone who wants to see harm reduction has to get involved, because we have the TPD3, we've got COP9 happening, the WHO's thing at the end of the year, as has been mentioned by Clive, and these are huge, huge threats. And like Mark says, consumers are very, very valuable. Our voice counts, and we have to make it heard.
I have to say one thing. You have to join an organization if you're a consumer. You will, in order to orientate yourself through the complexities of all this stuff, the politics, who to write to and when the decisions are being made. It's very difficult to do that as as just a kind of ordinary civilian vapor. So, get your hand in your pocket, sign up for the New Nicotine Alliance or one of the consumer organizations in other countries, and they will help to orientate you so that you can be effective in using your political capital to the best possible effect. Join an organization.
Question coming from Charles. Why do nicotine pouches need to be regulated? What's the kind of current state of nicotine pouches in the UK? Because this is one that I think has got also quite low levels of familiarity alongside heated tobacco.
We've actually written to Department of Health asking for some light touch regulation on this, because there are unscrupulous people selling them. The last thing you want is that turning into another moral panic, which ended up in the 80s and 90s with a ban on snus. That's a simple answer. We need some sort of regulation, something that people can enforce. And it's great that they're unregulated and that the government is relaxed about them. They should be relaxed about them. But we need some sort of regulation to stop some really unscrupulous people doing some pretty nasty things, which could destroy it for everyone.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's two reasons to it. I mean, we've seen some ridiculous products, particularly on the Russian market, with like 250 milligrams of nicotine in them, so almost fatal doses. But also, one of the functions of regulation is to give people more confidence that they can use them, that somebody's got their back when they buy them from a shop. So if you want people to take them up, you have to give them a feeling that there's some sort of legitimacy behind them. So something about, the product standards, make sure they're properly registered, that they've not got contaminants in them, the level of nicotine is sort of acceptable and so on, be beneficial in the marketplace in helping people choose those options.
And just a final question, because it's quite a big one, I guess, that's coming from quite a few people who are just confused as to why, in the face of all this evidence, other countries are taking such an anti-vaping, anti-harm reduction approach. What's the reasoning behind that? Why is it that in the US, the EU, and the WHO, there is such an opposition to harm reduction approaches?
Oh my God.
I said it was a meaty one.
It's a massive question.
Whole different webinar on that.
Well, yeah, quite.
Can I have a go at this? I've just written an article about this.
Sure.
So I think I would say, I mean, a lot of people go, oh, follow the money and all this, but I don't think that's the main reason. I think the main reason is that the harm reduction approach is basically countercultural for the tobacco control community, which has in its toolkit measures that are basically imposed by state actors by law, and they involve high levels of control, punitive, coercive, restrictive sort of measures. They involve a controlling sort of relationship with the citizen, i.e. as a patient who's in treatment and they're offering a cure, that kind of thing. You then come along with a different way of doing things. It's a completely different public health model that's behind this. It's one in which knowledgeable consumers interact with nimble innovators in a free market that is lightly regulated and in which the public health community has very little involvement. Okay, it thrives on not on a sort of treatment and illness paradigm where you're told that you have tobacco use dependency and that this is a psychiatric disorder. You're told that we are going, instead of you moving from smoking to abstinence, and we will help you with withdrawal and craving, we are going to replace one pleasure with another, and that other pleasure will be far less harmful to you. Now, if you can imagine, that is very countercultural in the public health community, kind of not what they do. Private sector, free market, consumer-driven, empowered solutions to public health problems is not really in their playbook. So that's the first thing. And I think that generates almost instinctive hostility. The second thing, I think, is sort of institutional inertia. So there are research institutions, universities, academics, activist groups, foundations, institutions like the CDC, the WHO, and so on, that over many decades built a kind of fighting machine for going to war with big tobacco and taking on smoking. And by sort of around 2010, I think they were getting a bit bored with that. That battle was becoming stale. The smokers were ever more problematic, you know, sort of deprived and difficult to reach and so on. Along comes something new. And instead of going, wow, this is actually the answer to our prayers, they had a hostile response to it. They took their war fighting machine, they swiveled the gun turret through 90 degrees and started blasting away at the new thing. And the new thing was e-cigarettes or heated tobacco products or tobacco harm reduction. Because their old adversary, the tobacco industry, was involved, that kind of added extra legitimacy to it. And that's basically where they are. They are fighting the same war with a different enemy, using the same methods and the same means, but to a completely counterproductive and self-defeating end if their goal was truly to reduce the amount of harm and disease that there is in the world.
Well, I think that's about as comprehensive an answer as we can get. That was absolutely lovely food for thought, and that's good timing as well, because I'm afraid that's now all the time we have for this evening. So thank you all very much for coming and attending, and thanks to our excellent speakers. Hopefully we'll see you all next week for our next ASI webinar. If you're interested in reading more on the topic, the most recent ASI papers on this from yours truly are Up in Smoke and 1 Billion Years of Life, which you can find on the research section of our website. I'd very much encourage everyone to check out Clive's wonderful blog as well, which is counterfactual, I believe. Am I right in saying? Yep. And also make sure to, if you're a consumer interested in affecting change on these issues, sign up for We Vape and also the new Nicotine Alliance. I'm also in the final stages of drafting a new report tackling some of the issues that we explored today, which will be released in the coming weeks. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. But just leaves me to say thank you again to Clive, Mark, and Martin for coming along, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Sorry for hogging the last answer.
No problem. No problem. It was a good one.